Okay, hey, if you we're gonna do the second half of the French Revolution here. If you remember from Monday, we talked about the economic situation of France. Just a touch. The economic situation from France and the reaction of the French people. Uh, the calling of the three estates, the Estates General, and then the formation of the National Assembly, the formation or the passage of the Declaration of Rights of Man. Then Louis the 16th tries to escape, and the nations of Europe basically passing a decree that if Louis and the Queen are harmed, that Austria and Prussia are going to attack France. Okay, so in 1791, the revolution is going to take a pretty substantial turn to the left, to radicalism. Before that, we had basically a constitutional monarchy in which Louis's powers were being limited, and he had some economic vetoes and things like that from the people. But after 1791, that's all going to go away, and especially after his failed escape attempt, the goodwill of the French people towards to their monarch is going to go away. And so the Jacobins and the Sans-Culottes are going to be the most outspoken groups of this. The Sans-Culottes are going to be really the working men, the working class. This is going to be people that are going to be really influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, that everybody's going to be equal. And so although that they're going to lack probably some of the political astuteness and education of the bourgeoisie or of the upper middle class, they're going to come to power through just the will of the majority. Their main allies, I suppose, or the group that they're going to work with, are also the Jacobins, who are going to be more of a bourgeois lawyer type, that are going to have more radical ideas than we'd previously seen in the French Revolution. And this is where once the Jacobins and the Sans-Culottes take power of the National Assembly, things are going to fly off the rails pretty quick. And so they're threatened by Prussia, they're threatened by Austria. And so one of the things that the Jacobins and the Sans-Culottes want to do is they want to spread the French Revolution to other nations. They want to take this idea of liberty and fraternity and brotherhood, and fraternity, I guess, and push it on to other countries. And so one of the ways that they think they're going to do that is by declaring war on Britain and Prussia. Remember, Prussia's already threatened them. Britain is a longtime enemy of France at this point, and so it makes sense to them at that point. And so in August, so that's April, by August of 1792, the war is really going very poorly for France. The generals, some generals have probably left France or defected during the revolution. France still doesn't have any money. Just because there's new leaders doesn't mean the monetary situation has changed. It's a poor situation, and so the war is going poorly, and the mob of people decides to attack the king's palace in France. And they blame the king for the failures of the army and what's going on. Like, hey, you know what? He's probably telling the Prussians our military secrets, and so they attack. They attack the king's palace in two times. And the royal family barely escapes. A couple of the king's guards are actually killed, and the family flees to protection of the National Assembly. And so at this point, the constitutional monarchy is over. The king is throwing himself on the good nature of the assembly for the safety of his family. Um, in 1792, after that, the monarchy is abolished. The common people basically take control. We have some kind of a democracy. We have the democracy starting to take hold, in which all males are given the right to vote, not just property owning males like in the American Revolution or the American early days of the American Republic. All males are given the right to vote. We abolish the monarchy. We make France a true republic. And the Jacobins, they write a new constitution. They take the land and the titles from all of the nobility, so everybody's equal. And so everybody's going to be referred to as citizen. There's not going to be a hierarchy in society at this point. Louis XVI is going to be charged with treason. He's going to be found guilty. And so on January 23rd, 1793, Louis is going to be taken to the guillotine and killed. He's going to be accused of like treason and theft and all the things you typically accuse a monarch of. And the French are going to chop his head off, just similar to the way that the British chopped off the head of Charles I. And then Marie Antoinette, his wife, is going to be assassinated shortly thereafter. She's going to have her head chopped off in October of 1793. And so it's things are going to start to really kind of fall off the rails here. Killing the king and killing Marie Antoinette doesn't really solve any of the problems of the French Revolution or the financial problems of France. And so the French Revolution, the National Assembly decides that they're going to create a 12-person board, and they're going to call this the Committee of Public Safety. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to preserve the ideas of the revolution. They're trying to preserve the revolution, save it from enemies within France is what they're looking at. And they're trying to figure out why the war effort is not working against Britain and Prussia. And so this 12-person board is elected, and it creates this idea of an all-out war effort. And so before, France was fighting these other nations with only its professional army. Now, after that, the Committee of Public Safety basically institutes a mandatory national draft. Young men are recruited into the army to fight. Married men are to go and work in industry and make war products like guns and blankets and those types of things for the men that are going off to fight. Women are supposed to make tents and clothes and whatnot, and old people are supposed to inspire the young to go out and fight for the ideas of the revolution, right? And so these new numbers of people are going to overwhelm the enemy on the battlefield. It's going to really kind of turn the war against Britain and Prussia to the advantage of the French. Remember, we're fighting in a time frame where we don't have repeating rifles, and bayonet charges are still used, and hand-to-hand combat is really the way that battles are decided on the battlefield. And so just the influx of individuals onto the battlefield are going to be advantageous for the French cause. Maximilien Robespierre is going to become the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, and he's going to take over this, and he's going to basically just run this French Revolution straight into the ground. He's a believer in the ideas of the will of the people, right, like that, and he sees any opposition to his will is treason. So which is odd, because he's going to believe the people put him in power, and anybody that doesn't agree with him is treasonous. And so we moved from a situation like with the American Revolution, in which we have a republic in a nation of laws, and we spend a lot of time developing those laws with the Constitution and those types of things, versus the French Revolution, when it gets to the period of the Committee of Public Safety and the appointment of Maximilien Robespierre as the leader, that the laws no longer matter, and it's more of this idea of the will of the people, or specifically the will of Robespierre, to control the movement of the revolution. Quote from Robespierre here is, "Liberty cannot be secured unless criminals lose their heads." And so people are going to, a large number of people are going to die because of the action. All right. So Robespierre is going to usher in this this period that's known as the Reign of Terror. And so basically what we have is we have more or less military tribunals or just makeshift courts where people can be accused of being being enemies of the revolution or being enemies of the state of France. Or if you say something bad about Robespierre, or you say something bad about the war effort, or you say something bad about really just French society in general, that you can be executed or put to death because of this. And so the Reign of Terror leads to this this period in which there's 2,400 people killed in Paris within a year, and like 40,000 people are going to be executed throughout Paris during this Reign of Terror, in which people are going to be falsely accused of being criminals against the working against the revolution, falsely accused of committing crimes against France, and those types of things. The Committee of Public Safety, eventually the terror turns on them very shortly after, within a year and a half, and Robespierre is actually executed during this time frame. He's accused of being the enemy of the revolution, and he's sentenced to death. And Robespierre actually tries to commit suicide before that. He tries to shoot himself in the head. And when he does, the bullet misfires or something, and it goes through his, instead of killing himself, he ends up shooting out part of his jaw and disconnecting his jaw. And so he's in horrible pain. And he's not able to talk before his execution. He actually bandages his face up to hold his jaw in place. And before the guillotine is dropped, the bandage is ripped off and his jaw falls off of his face, and then his head gets chopped off. And so Robespierre meets his end that way, which is not great for him. So then in 1795, we move from the director of, or the Committee of Public Safety, to something known as the Directory Government, in which we go from 12 men to 5. And it's a 5-man, kind of a 5-man executive branch with a 2-house legislature. And the government it's weak and it's facing problems. It has the war. No one's done anything about the high food prices. And so nobody's happy with anything that's going on. People are tired of the instability of the government and the bloodshed of the revolution and the chopping off of everybody's heads, and the young men going off to fight the revolution and fight these wars. And this just doesn't work. And so a very charismatic general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte rides into Paris and overthrows the Directory, uses his military prowess and popularity to gain favor in Paris. And so Napoleon overthrows the Directory in 1799. 5 years later, he actually names himself the Emperor of France. He's very astute militarily. He leads the French army in victories against basically all of Europe. The first thing he does is he controls food prices. He puts government limits on prices, so he drives the food prices down. He starts to encourage the development of new industries, not just like artisan industries, but like large scale industrial jobs for people. He builds roads and schools, so he's going to put people to work, which is going to give them money, which is going to allow them to buy food. He sets up public schools that are going to train military officers and better educate the people. So it gets people off the streets complaining about the government, gives them places. He backs off a lot of the social changes that were put in place in the revolution. The Catholic Church at one point is banned. Napoleon comes back in. He returns lands that were seized by the revolution to the Catholic Church. He brings the Catholic priests back in. He encourages the nobles that had fled France to come back. Offers this idea of stability, which is going to not only bring back the nobles and stability, but also money. He starts to fulfill he starts to fulfill some of the government jobs based on merit and not patronage. And so the better people in France are starting to go to the better jobs. Women are actually going to lose some of their rights of citizenship and some of the privileges that they've made, or some of the rights that they've gained during the revolution. They're going to take a step back. Excuse me. Napoleon's just absolutely a wonderful military general. And one of the advantages that he realizes that he has over other European nations is the fact that he has a large army, and he has a large army that can be replenished. And because of the mandatory military service for young men in France, Napoleon's able to lose huge amounts of people on the battlefield and still claim victory. And so, he's going to conquer the Netherlands and Belgium and parts of Italy and parts of Germany, and he defeats the Holy Roman Empire. And by 1810, he's going to control a lot of Europe. So he doesn't control Britain, he doesn't control Russia, but he controls everything here in purple and blue to some extent or another. And so, he's extended the French Empire and the ideas of the revolution a great way. And so many people see the rebellion or the success of Napoleon as bittersweet, especially if you're not in France. Number one, it's awesome because monarchs are no longer no longer ruling places like I don't know, Spain or wherever. But at the same time, excuse me, these people want to rule themselves. They don't want to be ruled by Napoleon. They don't want to be ruled by France. And so nationalism starts to pop up during this time frame. And so you start to see the call for individual nations. And Britain is the only major country in Europe that's not under the control of France. And we're not going to consider Russia part of Europe at this point, right? And so Britain is going to use its navy to fight the French, and they ward off a French invasion with a military victory, and the French and the British impose blockades on each other, which are going to involve the Americans as well. Like the Americans are going to go into a quasi war with France during this time frame because the French have seized some American ships, and the British have done the same. The British are impressing American sailors or forcing American sailors to serve on British ships. And so the Americans are going to run into some problems during this time frame with the rest of Europe. Okay, so Britain's getting rich, and they're growing. France sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States. And France has given up their ideas of spreading the revolution to the New World. And so France invades Spain, and Napoleon replaces the Spanish king with his brother, and the Spanish begin to revolt. And then the French get tied into this weird guerrilla warfare that breaks out in Spain, and the British are going to send help to help with the Spanish rebels. And Spain is a very mountainous, tactically difficult region to fight in, and so the French are going to get tied down there. And over 7 years, 200,000 French are going to die. And so, like, there's small fights, there's no major battles, and Napoleon is just tied down into what modern historians would refer to as a people's war, a war of rebellion, or a war of terrorism, I guess, against a major power. And so the French controls the major cities in Spain, but the rebels continue to control the countryside. And the French are upset, and so they start to kill villagers in response to the war. And so, like, they commit basically war crimes against the Spanish people, which are going to further reduce the popularity of the Spanish troops. And so all the killing of the villagers was get more people to join the rebels, right? And so the French are unable to come this opposition, and it's just going to tie them down. The Austrians are also going to be resistant to French control, and the French are going to put down many rebellions in Austria. And one of the ways that Napoleon is going to to deal with that is he's going to divorce his wife and he's going to marry an Austrian princess. And if we've paid attention to anything, well, I guess if we pay attention to history, one of the things that we don't want to do if we're in royalty is marry an Austrian princess, because things don't ever really work out all that well for anybody that does. And so many see this act of Napoleon marrying into royalty as a way of him trying to make himself king of France. And not only does he want to necessarily make himself king of France, he wants to make himself emperor. And so he crowns himself emperor. He basically brings the Pope into France or into Paris, and he crowns himself emperor of France. And so Russia and France run into some problems in the summer of 1812. Russia basically withdraws from the continental system of trade with France, and Napoleon in return invades France with his grand army of 600,000 troops, and the Austrians resist. Oops, I'm sorry. And the Russians are going to employ what's going to be referred to as a scorched earth policy. Or tactics. If you look at Russia here, Russia's ginormous, like it doesn't even fit on our map. And so what the Russians are going to do is they're just going to fall back and fall back and fall back, and Napoleon and his army are going to march further and further and further into Russia. And by the time they get to Moscow in September, the weather's going to change, right? And so October, November, December is going to be winter, and snow's going to fall. The weather's going to change drastically. And the French are not prepared for this. And so the French start a mass evacuation of Russia, unable to feed themselves, unable to supply themselves, unable to shelter themselves from the cold. And so by the time all these troops get back to France, only 10,000 survive the return back to France as they're attacked by the Russian army, attacked by Russian people. They die to exposure of the elements, they die of starvation, and Napoleon is horribly weakened. Right, here's a picture of our grand retreat. And so following the defeat of Napoleon's army in Russia, he's also defeated at the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, and he's captured and he's exiled to an island in the Mediterranean, Elba. And Louis, what is that, the 17th, is put back in charge of France. And so now France has a weak king that is still dealing with economic problems that were not really ever taken care of with Napoleon or with the revolution. And in March of 1815, so shortly thereafter, and a couple of years later, Napoleon escapes off his island, returns back to France, gathers a new army, and they march out to try to reconquer Europe. And eventually they're defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and Napoleon is sent to St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he is poisoned and dies. So there's a lot of controversy about the French Revolution and about the rule of Napoleon. You know, why does France, they get rid of one king and then they just welcome an emperor and Napoleon? They try to spread the revolution, but then they try to spread the revolutionary ideas, but then they fall victim to their own shortcomings with the Reign of Terror. But the ideas of the French Revolution are important, and they still affect us today in the fact that you have equality of people regardless of race or regardless of social class. Again, you have the ideas of the Enlightenment with property, life, and liberty. But the changes we're going to see in Europe are that the maps of Europe are going to be withdrawn, the monarchs are going to be put back in power for a short period of time. And the ability of Russia, the ability of nations to modernize are going to be realized during this time frame. The fact that, like, if I can put more product on a field of battle, then I'm probably going to, if I can put more product on a field of battle, I'm probably going to win. And so you can see the I don't know. You can see the changes in Europe during this time frame. There's France. You have the Holy Roman Empire. You have the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and then afterwards, the Kingdom of Russia is going to grow, and so forth. Okay. So we have that. We're going to move into the Industrial Revolution here shortly. I know that's not the best. I don't think that's the best example of the French Revolution, but that's kind of what we have right now. So you're going to have you'll have an assignment on Canvas to take care of, and hopefully you can get that done by Monday. And we'll just go from there. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you later.